Hi, my name is Kelly Hood. I'm a cybersecurity engineer at Optic Cyber Solutions. And today we're going to be talking about bringing cybersecurity and privacy together through NIST frameworks. So I wanted to start off by kind of getting an idea of how many people use NIST frameworks, but we all know that I won't be able to see or hear you, but I imagine that a lot of you probably are using those frameworks. And one thing I wanted to point out was there's actually a lot of frameworks out there. We're probably all very familiar with the risk management framework. Also, the cybersecurity framework is very common and are very popular. The privacy framework was released just earlier this year in January. But there's also many other frameworks that they have that are being used, such as the big data interoperability framework, cyber-physical systems, and the NIST workforce framework. But today specifically, we wanted to focus on two of these frameworks for cybersecurity and privacy. So as we walk through these slides, we're going to talk a lot about how to look at cybersecurity and privacy and bring them together to manage a program in one way, and how we can leverage these two frameworks that NIST has put out to help us do that in the most effective way we can. So both of these frameworks here you'll see are set up in a very similar structure. They have three main components, being the core, the profiles, and the tiers. And just like if you're familiar with the cybersecurity framework, as the privacy framework was developed, it was developed in a structure to be very similar and make it easy for us to use those two documents together. So the core will help us enable that dialogue and understand what we need to do. The profiles will help us understand the priorities and what we're doing now versus what we could be doing and maybe what we need to do better. And the tiers will help us understand how we need to do those things and how kind of mature those items need to be. So security and privacy are things that many people do, many different organizations will do through one program or look at separately. But really, there is an overlap between the two. They have some very different concepts, but a lot of things that do align. And I wanted to take a moment to talk about those similarities. And we can see some of that here through this Venn diagram overlap that I think many people are starting to use to understand how much of an overlap there is. But here we can see on the left, focusing specifically on cybersecurity, where that's really focused on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, where privacy risks are more focused on what are the unintended consequences of data processing. What might people be doing with data that might be secure, but still not what that was supposed to be used for. And we can see that in the middle, that overlap is really centered on a privacy breach, that it may have something to do with confidentiality, because information is being disclosed, but it's also a privacy breach because that information wasn't intended to be shared. And so for an example here, we wanted to just talk about something like smart meters, where it may be working as expected because the energy company is recording how much energy we're using and they want to use that to be able to bill us. But if all of a sudden that information got out, and people that we did not want to know how much power we were using could then see if we maybe weren't using power over a certain number of days, maybe indicating that we're on vacation, or we're surging with using a lot of power. If that information starts being used in a different way, that could be a privacy risk where there would not be a security concern, and could be a breach of that personal information. So we're seeing a lot of growth, but also a lot of challenges still, just understanding how much of that overlap there is, where they're similar, where they're different, and finding the language to communicate that. And that's what I really like about using these frameworks together, is that it's providing a way to have that, to use a common language and to find an easy way to communicate and document that to help the conversation moving forward. So just a little bit more on the privacy framework, since it is so new. It was released back in January of this year. We can see NIST started working on this document over the last couple of years, mostly last year, and all the development, having several workshops and getting lots of community feedback just in the way that they built out the cybersecurity framework back in 2014 and before, to make sure that they really got the industry experts out there to contribute to the document to make sure that it was going to be a solid framework for the community to use. So I think that was really helpful, and they'll continue to gather updates and feedback now that the document is being published to make sure that it stands up moving forward as well. So this being the new document that it is, we wanted to make sure that we spent a little bit of time up front focusing on it, talking about the privacy framework and provide an overview of what it is, and then we'll get into how it relates back to the cybersecurity framework, where are those overlaps, and then we'll walk through a use case for using the two together in a profile to document that all at once to help us our next steps moving forward. So as I had previously mentioned, both of these frameworks have a core, and that is where we document what is needing to be done for privacy here. So we can see down below, there are 5 functions similar to how the cybersecurity framework is laid out, but the functions may look a little bit different. There are a couple that are have the same high-level function, but some of the things we need to do underneath are a little bit different. But there's also a couple new things here as well. So here we can see for each of the functions here, identify you will recognize from the cybersecurity framework. It helps establish an understanding of areas where we need to consider our privacy data. We want to identify what assets we have that hold this data and what type of data we do have. And that's really done in the identify function. Next, in the govern function, this actually was not a completely new concept in the cybersecurity framework. It was actually a category within the identify function, but they've broken it out here because of its importance in the privacy world, that we needed to look at, make sure that it had an equal footing and that it was considered moving forward. The third function there, control, is one of the new concepts the privacy framework is introducing, really focused on how people are handling this data and managing things like de-identification of data or how it's being processed. The fourth function, communicate, is also a concept that was included in the cybersecurity framework, but that was elevated here as well to really make sure that everybody was aware of what the data was and how it was being handled, and that was communicated both within the organization and externally with customers or different individuals that are having their data being processed by these organizations. And then finally, we have the protect function here, which will also look familiar at being a function of the cybersecurity framework as well. We'll see that there's a lot of similar concepts in this functional area, but also a lot of new categories and subcategories that are being built out under it to handle some of those data processing protections. So here's just a preview of, I had mentioned the categories. When you go one step down from the function, there are categories under that and then subcategories under that. The subcategories are the lowest level of granularity within the framework core, providing outcomes of what we should be doing to meet the intent of these subcategories and these concepts. However, they don't tell you how to do it. That was one really important distinction of both of these frameworks, really, is that they want to tell you what you need to do and give you an idea of what your goal is by telling you something. Here you can see on the last one on this slide, data at rest are protected, without telling you how to do it, because really that's going to vary significantly from organization to organization on how that's being done based on the sensitivity of that data and how large they may be. But we want to make sure that everybody is protecting that data at rest in some fashion. So it provides, it's an outcome-based framework that will tell you what you need to do, just doesn't get into the how you need to do it, which also allows it to be more tailorable and usable across organizations of all sizes and across sectors. One other thing I wanted to point out here for the core is that it is tailorable. So if there are some categories or subcategories that just don't make sense for your organization because of your business model, you don't have to use it. It's not a requirements list at this point, at least. There's nobody requiring that it's being used and saying you must do all of these categories and some categories. But they are generally, all of them are good things to do and definitely things that need to be considered when building out your privacy program. So next, just to highlight a little bit more on that hierarchical structure where we have the 5 functions here on the left. that are broken down into the categories. There's actually 18 categories in the privacy framework. Here's just a preview of a selection of one from each of those functions. And then the subcategories within those categories, which there are 99 subcategories across the model. So it is a hierarchy that kind of expands as you go down and provides additional context so that you know what are those outcomes, what are those important things I need to consider and look at the risk of the data that I'm holding to figure out how to implement those in my organization. So the next component of the framework is the tiers. And the tiers are, you would select based on your organizational risk strategy, basically. There are 4 different tiers here. We can see in the middle of the screen, it goes from partial to risk-informed to repeatable to adaptive. They're not intended to be a tiered maturity model. They're not exclusive or strictly independent of each other. There can be some overlap. And not everybody needs to be a tier 4. It really depends on your organization and your risk and what is the size of your organization, how much risk are you willing to accept, and basically how formal of a program do you need to have. We do often see the case where the larger the organization, the more structured their program needs to be. But there is a lot of gray area in there in determining that. But having these tiers and having the definition in the framework itself, all 4 of these tiers are broken out with a full description, and there are kind of subsections within those talking about the privacy risk management processes, how those how the privacy risk management program is integrated across the organization, kind of the ecosystem relationship, understanding how your organization works with other organizations, and then workforce, understanding your personnel and those privacy risks of the data that they're handling and their data themselves. So these 4 tiers are further broken down in the document, where you can really read through and get an understanding of where your risks are, where you need to be really consider or really stringent on what you need to have in place and make a determination on what tier you would like to be. And a lot of people, there's a lot of different ways to use the tiers. Some organizations will choose a specific tier and say, I want to be a tier 3 across my whole program. Other organizations we've seen will assign a tier to every subcategory and say, we think we only need to be a partial here, but we want to be adaptive in this other subcategory. So there's a lot of different ways to use it, but it provides a really great way, it's a great way to have a measuring stick to show how robust these different things need to be conducted. And here we can see some of those subcategories that I had mentioned, or the subcomponents that make up those tiers within those that do span across all 4 tiers that are considered when selecting which tier you would be. The third component of the privacy framework is the profiles. And the profile is really a mechanism for recording all of this information in one place. There's, again, no right or wrong way to create a profile. I've seen it done as a document, as a spreadsheet, as a graphic, but it's really just a way to capture what is your privacy program, what does that include, what is scoped in, what is scoped out, how mature are those capabilities. And it can also be a way to align it with other regulatory requirements or compliance standards or things you may need to consider. It's really just a great way to bring everything together and document it at one place. So we can see here across the bottom in that image, where we start off with the core that you can see has all 5 functions with several categories listed out. But then they've broken it down for the current profile to, it looks like they've only got a few things in place. They don't have things across all 5 functions. But in a target profile, they have added a few more things to say, we want to do more, we think we need to do more, and they've added those there. But that's the other really important thing about profiles, is that you can have more than one. And a lot of times it makes it a lot of help for organizations to break out and have a current state profile reflecting exactly what they're doing today, with no judgment, to say this is what we're doing, right or wrong. We want to have that written down so that we have an understanding of what we're doing. And then you can kind of draw a line in the sand and say, this is where we need to be after looking at our risks and our regulatory requirements, to say, we need to set a target. We have some areas we need to grow, and this is what our target is. which also then helps you understand how to adjust and how to create a roadmap and figure out what you need to do to reach that target. But having it documented in one place is half the battle to getting those things done. And it takes it from being kind of a nebulous thing that there's a lot of things you need to do to being more tangible, and you can really break it down into manageable chunks. So next, we're going to run through a quick overview of the cybersecurity framework. You'll see a lot of the same constructs because they were built in a very similar way. But we'll talk through that a little bit before moving on to our example. So here in the cybersecurity framework, we also have the core, but you'll see that there are different functions. So over on the left side of the screen, you can see the 5 functions for the cybersecurity framework being identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. We saw identify and protect in the privacy framework, but there are those 3 other functions that were not included in the privacy framework at the function level. Some of the constructs are included at a lower level of category and subcategory, but the privacy framework really wanted to highlight those other areas of importance. So here we have also the categories listed out in that image, but once again, it's a common set of cybersecurity activities that are showing our desired outcomes. It's not about saying how you need to do this and any specific technology that needs to be used, but these are things that you should be doing, but you'll have to decide how to do them for yourself. It was written again to be specific enough to provide a guidance or a structure through the framework structure that it is, but also be flexible enough to be used across all sectors and companies of all different sizes. So here, as we had talked a little bit early on about how some of the cybersecurity risks and the privacy risks are different but similar, we can see that Venn diagram again, understanding how the cybersecurity risk is focused on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and privacy risk is focused on that unintended consequence of basically people doing things with your data that you did not plan. So even though it's secure, it may not be private. It may not be private, and even if it's private, it may not be secure. And those are different concepts. But where we see that overlap is in that privacy breach, and you'll see that also reflected in the functions from the 2 frameworks. So I really like this image here on this slide showing exactly what the functions are from both of those frameworks, from the cores that we just walked through. You can see on the left, the cybersecurity framework has the 5 functions showing kind of the life cycle approach from the identifying what you have, to understand so you know what you need to protect, then implementing those protection controls to make sure that you're protecting all of your assets and information you have, being able to detect when something goes wrong, and then react to respond, to prevent, to stop an incident, and then fully recover from that incident. On the right, you'll see those the functions that we talked through a moment ago for the privacy framework with the identify, making sure you have a solid governance process in place to understand all of the data and how it's being handled, controlling that data and communicating how it's being handled. And then you'll see that actually protect and as well as detect, respond, and recover are also in the middle there, showing where some of that overlap is, where you will need to do both to have in your in a cohesive program to address both. So it provides a nice way to kind of show how the functions, how they align and how they are different here in this image. Here we have the cybersecurity framework tiers. So much like the privacy framework tiers, they have it's the same 4-tier scale, going from partial to risk-informed to repeatable to adaptive, but the criteria for each tier is different. There's a lot of the privacy framework tiers had the notion of the workforce and looking at the ecosystem relationships, where the cybersecurity framework also has that notion of external participation that's really working with the community. So there are some overlaps, but there are some differences. Here we're going to be looking specifically at our cybersecurity risk management process, then our privacy risk management process. But because it uses that common language and it's structured in the same way, it provides an easy way to communicate that back and forth, and to help organizations determine, do they only need to be partial, where they've got some ad hoc things. They know good things are being done, but it may not be consistent, or it may not be fully mitigating their risk. Or do they really need to be all the way up to adaptive at a tier 4, where they have everything, they know that their controls are in place to manage the risks that they have. They've got formal, repeatable processes in place, and they have it all documented, and they're communicating and looking to grow and predict what will happen next, rather than hanging out and waiting for something new to go wrong. And then finally, the third step here, the third capability, once again, is the profiles. So here is just another picture showing really the profile is the way to document all of this important information, and we can do it all together. So here, there's once again no right or wrong way to do it, but it's as long as you're bringing together your business objectives, maybe your threat environment, any additional requirements and controls you have. By having this one structured profile, you can pull it in from all of these different sources, even just on the cybersecurity side or the privacy side, but really you can also bring them together. And that's what we're going to walk through today, is how we can use the profiles to bring all of this information into one place and tailor it as needed. Here I wanted to highlight that NIST has actually put out a really great resource as well for understanding where some of those alignments are. They've published a crosswalk from the NIST Privacy Framework to the Cybersecurity Framework, where you can see here in column D and F specifically, they've got the NIST Privacy Framework core, so you can see the categories and the subcategories listed out. And then column H on the slide, you can see the Cybersecurity Framework subcategories. So we can see exactly where that relationship is of IDIM-P1 is related to IDAM-1 and 2 from the Cybersecurity Framework. So it provides a really easy way to get a quick view of where you might be able to gain some efficiencies there. And then also on the right-hand side in columns J and K, they've also gone through and kind of shaded some of the cells, which I think is just fantastic to understand where things are literally, or basically a copy and paste of if it was written one way in the cybersecurity framework, it's written exactly the same way in the privacy framework. That's where that overlap is of things that matter in both worlds. And then there's a lighter shading as well to show where things were similar to a subcategory or a category from the cybersecurity framework, but where they've been tailored or adjusted in some way or modified to better meet the needs of privacy concerns. So I think it's just a really great way as you scroll through that document, and there is a link at the bottom of the screen there, or you can find it on NIST's website, to be able to go through and see side by side, what are all the categories, what do they mean, how do they relate to each other, and really get a jump start on understanding that relationship. If you have a cybersecurity program already built out maybe, and you're looking to incorporate privacy, or you have a privacy program and you're looking to incorporate cybersecurity, this can be a really great tool to go between the two and provide that easy step to understanding where you may already have things done that you may not have realized, or that you don't need to start from scratch. So the last thing I want to cover before we jump into our example is the implementation steps here. So you can see that for the two frameworks, there are different implementation steps, but really they align very well. So we can see on the left for the privacy framework, we have our ready, set, go. So ready is used to identify and govern, looking at our identification and govern functions to get ready to basically understanding what we have so that we know what we need to do with it. The set step is based on an action plan to look at our profile, to create and look at our profiles really and say, okay, and now I know what I'm doing, but what do I need to do next? What's important? What do I need to prioritize? And then the go step is to move forward with the action plan. So once I know what I have and where I need to go, then I can create a plan and prioritization to make that happen and to get going. So you can see that on the left there. But for the cybersecurity framework, you'll see a lot of the words that I just said listed out in these steps. A lot of it's just kind of broken out in a more granular way and focused slightly differently, but I think they align very well. You can see starting at the top, you're prioritizing and scoping and orient. Those first two steps align very closely to the ready phase. And actually you can see that here. If I align these over, we'll see our reveal of how I see them aligning very clearly. That really the ready step aligns very well to steps 1 and 2 there. The next couple steps on the cybersecurity framework side creating a current state profile, conducting a risk assessment, and then defining our target state profile based on those risks that we have, align all very closely to the set step of the privacy framework implementation steps. And then finally, taking all that information we have, knowing what we have today, what our risks are, and what we need to do to address those risks, we can then look and identify our gaps. And once we have our gaps, we can analyze them, prioritize them, and build that action plan that would all be done in the go phase. So while at first glance they look very similar, or they look very different, you can see here, you can actually align them and do them both kind of in parallel in a very similar fashion. So that's what we're going to do today. So here I've got an example organization. We're going to walk through this example with our company ACME Financial, which is not a real company, but we're going to use them through our conversation. So ACME Financial is a regional financial institute out of hometown California. They provide personal banking services for over 4,000 customers. They have 48 ATMs, and they're just starting to establish online banking services. So they might be a little behind the times, but they're doing what they can. So we want to look at ACME Financial as we walk through these steps and figure out how we would help them to implement both privacy and security at once. And also, I wanted to point out that NIST has several use cases on their website as well. Since both of these frameworks are intended to be used of organizations of all shapes and size, they've documented 2 use cases that there will be a link later on to those that you can see different ways to implement the frameworks for different types of organizations as well. So if you're looking for somebody that looks like you or want to see more examples, NIST has some great resources there. So we're going to take ACME and we are going to leverage these implementation steps and walk through these to help them use both of the frameworks together. So we're going to start off with the ready step of the privacy framework and the prioritize and scope and orient step of the cybersecurity framework. So to do that, one of the great places to start is to kind of take a step back really and say, what is our organizational structure? What are our mission goals, our business drivers, our regulatory requirements, and just kind of lay it all out there. What's our budget? There's all kinds of things to consider, but just kind of looking at, who are we? What are our main objectives? What are we trying to do here? Often it's easy to kind of get down in the weeds and say, well, I know I need to implement data at rest, but what am I protecting? What data do we have? And sometimes just kind of taking a step back and saying, what are our main goals? Could really help scope those conversations to orient you as you move forward. So once you start answering some of those questions, you then want to look at the organization itself. So right now, ACME is a regional financial institution. So they're probably going to have a lot of they had several branch offices with lots of people that work for them. So one of the important steps is always when you look at doing an assessment for yourself or wanting to implement these things is, are you going to implement them for your whole company or are you going to focus on a subset? Because often that can change the regulatory requirements. If you've got different branches in different regions or different countries even, they're going to have different requirements. So today we're going to scope it for a few specific branch offices rather than looking at the company as a whole. And so we're going to, we'll define that moving forward. So here, for what we're going to scope into this conversation, we're going to look at 5 branch offices across the region. We had mentioned before that ACME is they want to start providing the online banking services from their headquarters facility in hometown California. And they have a lot of compliance requirements. Being in California, they have to be concerned with CCPA from the privacy perspective. They also had a request come in from a customer for a SOC 2 evaluation because they're handling payment card information. They need to be worried about PCI DSS and probably several other things. But so every organization is probably going to have a list of a few things they need to be concerned with. But by walking through the assessment, kind of laying it all out, it can often provide a way to streamline and see that some of these different standards and frameworks and models and requirements will have a lot of similarities across the documents. And so it can help you to kind of evaluate once but report many times. And then the final bullet here, we know that they're specifically concerned with the security of the online banking system, since this is something new that they're rolling out. Okay, so the next step we're going to take a look at, we're going to move into the set phase for the privacy framework, or the create a current profile phase for the cybersecurity framework. And to do that, we're going to, for this example, we're going to use a spreadsheet. I like using this just because it helps me provide a way to document it all, and I can have everything in a different column. You can see here on this spreadsheet that we've got it broken out much like the NIST crosswalk, where we've got the privacy framework subcategories in column D, and the privacy framework subcategories in D, and the cybersecurity framework subcategories in column C there. And then this is where we can also add in those other regulatory requirements. If we wanted to, we could add additional columns. And then you can just look across the rows to see all of those requirements side by side. As we do this and start documenting what we're doing, we also want to make sure we're looking across people, process, and technology. I think everybody is learning that there's no silver bullet. There's no technology you can implement that will just solve all your problems. Having everything, having things written down, having people understanding those and training on those things, and having the technology in place is really all has to work together. So we're going to try to remember to look at that as we walk through as well. So here we've just blown that up a little bit bigger as we walk through this. You can see a little bit bigger how we're going to walk across the top row, looking at asset management specifically. You can see in column C there, we can see the framework, the cybersecurity framework subcategory IDEN1, stating that physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. And then if we look one column to the right, we'll see that IDIM-P1 from the privacy framework is fairly similar, saying that systems, products, and services that process data are inventoried. So in both cases, we're looking at inventory. IDIM-P2 is focused specifically on the owners and operators and understanding the roles of who is assigned to protect this data, or who are the data owners, is what that second one is really focused on. So it's expanding a little bit, not just saying we need things inventory, but we need to know who the data owner is. And then IDIM-P7 is focused on the data processing environment, saying we want to have it documented in that inventory where this asset may be. One thing you'll also notice, if you're familiar with the cybersecurity framework, is in that second row for IDAM2, that row is focused on the software platforms. So IDAM1 is focused on physical systems and devices. IDAM2 is focused on software platforms and applications. So you'll actually notice that IDIM-P1 from the privacy framework, P1 and P7 are duplicated in that second row for software platforms. So it's very thorough and wanting to provide there are a lot of clarity and making sure that everything is documented. And that's what helps me, and we've seen help other clients that we've worked with, is just to have it all documented out, and it makes it very clean, and then you can walk through it in a very methodical way. But for now, we're just going to focus on that first row for physical devices and systems. So on this next slide, we've got a little bit of a reveal where we've got some of our current profile filled in here. And I do want to highlight that, a current profile can be done in a lot of different ways, but it doesn't have to be a novel. It doesn't have to be a whole other, every row doesn't need to be a policy in itself. I like to describe this as an elevator speech. Let me have your elevator pitch on how you're addressing IDAM1. And a lot of times we can do that, and it can be more meaningful, or more quickly, you can wrap your head around it easier for people that may not be familiar with cybersecurity or privacy, or if this is something new, but it helps just provide a quick summary so I know in general what's being done. And it also it provides a great way. You can, if you have other policies or standards or procedures or guidelines or something like that, you can reference them here. But just know that you don't have to rewrite your policies in a framework like this if you're wanting to document it. I really like using the elevator pitch to say, this is what I'm doing at a high level. If you want to know more, go check out my asset management policy, and you can point to those other places where you have more information. But now we're going to break it down a little bit. So you can see here, I've highlighted a couple of the key sections here. So as we walk through, so we went ahead and we filled it in to start the conversation, but now I want to show you how we got there. So looking on the left side, we can see in column C, back for the Cybersecurity Framework subcategory, IDAM1, we worried about those physical devices being inventoried. And we can see that that's tied very well to the subcategory from the Privacy Framework that's highlighted, saying we want to make sure all of our systems, products, and services that process data are inventoried as well. So we just want to take a step back and look at our organization. How are we handling inventories? And then we've documented that in column E to say acquisition processes include adding new devices to the centralized inventory. Simple, just, when we get something new, we do write it down. We have that provided in our centralized inventory. And if you have a certain database or something tool that you want to use, you could definitely call that out here, and that could be a really helpful additional piece of information to include. And then the second bit of that, in that same cell, we've mentioned that also we do annual site walkthroughs that are done every year to make sure that what we think we have is what we actually have, to validate that information so that we know that some things aren't getting lost or somebody's not entering things consistently incorrectly, but we're writing it down in a centralized inventory, and we are validating that annually through on-site walkthroughs. And then column F, we have included as notes. So this is a place that could be used in a lot of different ways. I'd like to use it as a way to just write down things I don't want to forget. So as I'm looking at this and I see that the acquisition process is I'm adding new devices to my inventory through the acquisition process, something that's jumping out at me is it doesn't say anything about things that we already had. So if this process has been around for a long time, you may have most of your devices included, but if this may be a new process, you might have a lot of assets that are not actually in your inventory just because they've been around for a while. So I want to make a note of that here in column F to say the inventory doesn't include devices that don't go through the acquisition process, obviously. So if you've got staff that maybe like to buy their own equipment or like to run down to the store when they need something and purchase it on their own, that may be an issue. So we're going to take a note of it, but also anything that existed before that process was created also hasn't been documented. So at this point, we don't know. It sounds like it could be a potential issue, but we haven't talked about risk yet, and we don't know what may be really important. So we're just going to leave that as a note for now, because in this current state profile, we just want to document what's being done today without any, when we get to the target state profile, that's when we'll start writing what we think we should be doing. So next, we'll look at the next section here for IDIMP2. For this subcategory, we want to make sure that we understand who the data owners are. So I've included in the activities in column E that system inventory, that inventory does include system owners. So we're denoting that there. So that sounds great. And then I didn't have any specific notes that I included. But in the final subcategory here, IDIMP7, data processing environment is identified. In that centralized database, there's no documentation of where that asset lives. So if I needed to find that asset, I would have record that I had it, but I don't actually know where to go to find it. So I'm going to make a note of that as well, that this is likely something that we want to do. Once again, I don't know exactly if it's, or how important it'll be, because we haven't looked at our risks yet, but it's something I want to make a note of so that I don't forget. And then we can make the decision later if we want to tailor this subcategory out, potentially if we think that's something that's not important or not a priority right now for our organization. So that was just an example of walking through a couple subcategories to create a current state profile. The next step is to conduct a risk assessment, like we said, so that we can start making those decisions about whether or not it's appropriate. And so we're still in the set step of the privacy framework, but we are going to move to step 4 for the cybersecurity framework. So this may look familiar, a heat map that a lot of organizations use to understand their risks by taking a look at the likelihood and impact of different things to occur. So that can be recorded in a lot of different ways, in heat maps or even risk registers. We've got on the next slide here, and And so how you do this is not the most important thing, but that it is being done, and that the organization is really looking at, based on the type of business that we have, the data we handle, we want to make sure we're protecting our data and our assets and our people as appropriate, and that we've got the right types of controls to make sure that that's happening so that we don't get any surprises later. So here's just, an example of a risk register that we won't get into too much, but there are, a lot of different ways to do that. But by going through and walking through your different vulnerabilities, writing up a summary of what that vulnerability is, what could potentially happen, and then documenting the likelihood, impact, and calculating a risk level, having all of that in a risk register is a great way to get started to understand where are your critical areas of risk, where are those really high priority items that are the things that you need to start with to make sure that they don't get overlooked. So once we have that understanding of our risks, we can then move to create our target profile. So here is just another kind of an example of a target profile, or kind of a summary here, that once you have that information, you can look at your the things that you wrote out, evaluate what you need to do to help you understand, what gaps you may have, how much they might cost to close, what budget are you going to need to do that, and what is the priority, and that gives you something really actionable to make a decision upon. And we'll walk through the target state profile in just a moment, a little bit more in depth. But I also wanted to point out something I had alluded to earlier about how you can, through the profiles, you can add the columns and add things to really streamline your process. If you've got other concerns like CCPA, PCI, and other regulations, you can add all of those into your profile and make sure you've got everything documented in one place. And because there are so many similarities across these types of documents, across controls, you can make sure that you streamline your process. So here we've got our target state profile template. You'll see that it looks very similar to the current state profile. We've just renamed it. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It just needs to be a place where you can write it down. So here's where, once again, you can add a column to say that I need to make sure that I've taken into account the CCPA requirement that relates to this topic. Or you could just add it in the notes field and say, I need to make sure that I have this type of encryption due to a contractual requirement that I have. But that can all be captured here. So once again, we've got we've pre-filled our elevator speech in here, but I did want to break it down a little bit for us again to walk through how we came to this. So you can see for IDAM1, IDIMP1 for the privacy framework, we were doing pretty well on that one. We had a centralized inventory in place, but I had made that note about the devices that didn't go through the acquisition process, or the devices that that we had before that process was created. So I want to make sure that, because my risk, I know that we have sensitive data, being a financial institution, that we're processing we have a lot of customers, and we've got sensitive information. We don't want that information to get out. That I think I need to know what all of my assets are, because that was a high risk for my organization if any of that got out. So I'm actually, just by adding one word into this statement up here to say all new and existing devices are recorded, now I know that I need to expand my inventory database. I was doing good things, but there's some more things I need to add. So all I did was add that, those words, and existing, to make sure that all of that's included. And then also we're going to continue to do that inventory, that validate our inventory database by doing those annual walkthroughs as well, to make sure that what we have is what we actually have and we know where it is, so that if anything did get out of hand or got away from us, we would know it. Next, we had our inventory owners, or our data owners. We wanted to know who they were, and we already had that taken care of. So I didn't change this statement at all. But then down here for IDIMP7, I didn't have my environment recorded. I didn't know where any of these assets lived. So I have included here in this middle statement that the inventory includes the data owners and the environment and the data types processed on the assets. So I've added that in to make sure that we know where these devices lived as well. So it doesn't have to be complicated or really complex. It just sets that, draws that line to say, I need to be here. And then it turns it into something that you could give to somebody to say, I need, help me make this happen, and help you provide something to draw a box around and scope out what it's going to take to make that happen. So the next step, step 6 for the cybersecurity framework, and we're moving on to the go phase of the privacy framework, is to determine, analyze, and prioritize those gaps. Now that I know what I'm doing today versus what I need to be doing, I can overlay all of that. I can take my cybersecurity or my current state profile, look at those risks that we use to develop our target state. But now I can overlay all of that information together and say, where are my gaps? So with that, we know based on the conversation we just had that some of the specific gaps we talked about is that my inventory only includes the existing assets. It didn't have the things that I had before, or it didn't include the things I had before the process was created. And I need to add an environment field to my inventory database. So that would be 2 specific examples of gaps that I would have and I would want to make sure were addressed. And a lot of times when we work with organizations to do this, it can vary a lot on how many gaps there are. We've seen up to, often several hundred gaps, but it doesn't have to be daunting. In the implement action plan and building a roadmap phase, as you're looking for figuring out how do you take all these hundreds of gaps and turn it into something manageable that you can do. Even every one step might be independently managed, but when you look at them in the bulk, it might seem like a lot. But there's a lot of ways to streamline that. If it's all focused on one topic, like asset management, that might be a way to break it down into projects. If you notice you have a lot of gaps related to policies, you maybe want to create a project on policy to develop, have a whole initiative on making sure that you have things written down. Maybe you've got a lot of good people doing good things, but if you had turnover with staff, you wouldn't know where to start. So there are ways you can look at these gaps and kind of group them to help figure out how to start. And it could be based on, priority, based on dependencies, things you need to do first, based on specific milestones that can be set. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. But that's really a key step, is that it doesn't have to be complicated, but breaking it down into those projects can make it very manageable. One thing I did want to point out here is that NIST has also put out the online informative references. So all of the subcategories we've been looking at for the privacy framework and the cybersecurity framework have been mapped to a lot of other documents. If you're looking for those regulatory requirements, trying to understand how those fit in here, a lot of that work has already been done, and that link is provided at the bottom of the screen here. So I just wanted to point out that even that you don't have to do it all yourself. There is a lot of great information out there. And with that, we've talked about a lot of different things. What are these frameworks, how they can be used together? I hope this has been really helpful. I really think these frameworks, bringing them together in this way, because they're aligned so similarly in their structure, it provides a really nice way to be able to handle cybersecurity and privacy at once through a common language. It can also provide great ways and collaboration opportunities if you've got different teams doing this. You can bring them together to say, this is what I'm doing today. What are you doing today? And how can we bring this together? We talked about how we can align them to compliance standards and how some of those mappings already exist. And by having all of this documented out, it can also help us to demonstrate due care. So much of showing that is just having something written, having an understanding, and showing that you have thought things out. I've also seen companies use this with their supply chain, both to communicate what they're doing and to ask suppliers whether their security or privacy practices they have in place. So that's I've seen been really effective. And then it helps also to help make those improvements in a cost-effective way. Sometimes it's so easy to get stuck in the weeds and want to implement a technology, but maybe it's tied to a low-risk item. By having it all backed up by risk, you can really make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck and focusing on those high-risk areas. And then finally, measuring improvements in information security and privacy. Having it all in this one framework provides that kind of a measuring stick to be able to continue to communicate using that moving forward and be able to show that improvement over time as you move from your current state to your target state. So finally, I just wanted to show of our resources. So I've mentioned several of these throughout the presentation today. We've got several on our Optic website, such as the Privacy and Cybersecurity Framework profile template that we used to walk through the examples to have the framework side by side. But also I've included all of the NIST resources that I've mentioned, from that crosswalk to the online informative references, as well as those use cases. So I wanted to thank you for your time and for joining this presentation. I hope you have found it informative, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you. My name is Kelly Hood.